At 10 o'clock on the morning of May 27th, 1942, SS Obergruppenführer Reinhard Heydrich stood in the doorway of his villa at Paninskie Brzezany, 14 kilometers north of Prague. His wife Lena watched from the entrance hall, their 3-year-old son Klaus pulling at her skirt. Heydrich adjusted the collar of his custom-tailored SS uniform, the one with the green piping that marked him as chief of the Reich main security office. He carried no sidearm. He had dismissed his usual escort. The morning was bright and unusually warm. Heydrich believed his work here was nearly complete. In 4 months as Reich protector, he had crushed the Czech resistance, executed thousands, and pacified what he called the most troublesome population in the Reich. The Czechs, he had told Berlin, are completely under control. In 4 days, he would fly to Paris to meet with Hitler about his next assignment. His driver, SS Oberscharführer Johannes Klein, held open the rear door of the dark green Mercedes 320 convertible B. Heydrich climbed in. The top was down. He had always preferred it that way. What Reinhard Heydrich did not know was that 7 kilometers away, at a hairpin turn on the road to Prague Castle, 2 men were waiting to kill him. They had been waiting for months, and they knew what would happen if they succeeded. The warning had arrived in London 6 weeks earlier, encoded and transmitted through the underground radio network. Colonel František Moravec, chief of Czechoslovak military intelligence in exile, read it in his cramped office on Porchester Gate. The message was from Jindra, the home resistance network operating inside the protectorate. "Cancel Anthropoid," the message read. "The cost will be too great. For the assassination of 1 German, many Czechs will die. Consider carefully. This cannot be undone." Moravec took the message to President Edvard Beneš, leader of the Czechoslovak government in exile. They sat in silence. Both men understood what the resistance was telling them. Both men knew the Nazis' policy of collective punishment. For every German killed, hundreds of Czechs would follow, perhaps thousands. "The hairpin turn," Moravec said quietly. The operatives had found their site. Confirmation that the mission was ready. Beneš looked at the map of Prague on his wall. "We need this," he said finally. "Without action, the Allies see us as collaborators. Without proof of resistance, Czechoslovakia ceases to exist." He turned to face Moravec. The operation proceeds. The hairpin turn. The point where history would bend. The choice that could not be undone. Reinhard Heydrich was 48 years old in May 1942, the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany, and perhaps the most dangerous. He had built the SS intelligence apparatus from nothing. He had organized the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing units that followed the Wehrmacht into Poland and the Soviet Union. In January, he had chaired the Wannsee Conference, where 15 men in 90 minutes planned the systematic murder of 11 million Jews. Hitler had sent him to Prague in September 1941 with a single directive: crush the resistance. The previous Reich protector, Konstantin von Neurath, had been too soft. Czech workers were slowing production. Underground networks were transmitting intelligence to London. The protectorate was an embarrassment. Heydrich solved the problem through calculated terror. In his first week, he declared martial law. Military tribunals worked through the night. By the end of October, 342 Czechs had been executed, 1,289 sent to concentration camps. The resistance networks fell silent. Production quotas rose. Heydrich rewarded compliant workers with increased rations and distributed shoes confiscated from Jews. The Czech population, he reported to Berlin, was broken. This was the problem that tormented Beneš in London. The Czechs were not resisting, and without visible resistance, Czechoslovakia's claim to post-war restoration weakened by the day. The Polish government in exile pointed to the Warsaw Underground. The French had their maquis. What did Czechoslovakia have? Silence and full factories. Operation Anthropoid had been conceived in October 1941, days after Heydrich's arrival in Prague. 2 soldiers from the Czechoslovak forces in Britain would parachute into the Protectorate, locate Heydrich, and kill him. The target was not random. Heydrich was irreplaceable. His death would demonstrate that no Nazi, however powerful, was safe, and it would force the Nazis to respond with a brutality that might finally wake the sleeping nation. Moravia selected 2 men, Warrant Officer Jozef Gabčík, 30 years old, from Polovci in Slovakia, Sergeant Jan Kubiš, 29, from Dolní Vilemovice in Moravia. Both had escaped through Poland after the German occupation. Both had fought in France. Both had volunteered knowing they would likely never return. "You understand what will happen after," Moravec told them before they left England. It was not a question. They understood. They went anyway. Gabčík and Kubiš trained for 3 months in the Scottish Highlands and at Special Training School 17 near Beaulieu. They learned close-quarters combat, silent killing, demolitions and escape techniques. They memorized the streets of Prague from outdated maps. They practiced with the Sten submachine gun until they could disassemble and reassemble it blindfolded. On the night of December 28, 1941, a Halifax bomber carried them over occupied Europe. At 2:24 a.m. on December the 29th, they jumped into darkness over Czechoslovakia. The navigator had erred. Instead of landing near Pilsen, they came down near the village of Nehvizdi, 60 kilometers to the east, their equipment scattered across frozen fields. They buried their parachutes and began walking. For 5 months they lived in the shadows of Prague. They moved between safe houses every few days, sheltered by families who knew that harboring them meant death. They made contact with Jindra, the resistance network run by Ladislav Vaněk. They studied Heydrich's movements, and they waited for the right moment. The problem was Heydrich's unpredictability. He varied his routes. He changed his schedule. His villa was a fortress. The only constant was his arrogance. He refused an armored car. He dismissed additional security. He believed the Czechs would never dare. In early May, a resistance contact who worked as a gardener at Heydrich's villa provided the intelligence they needed. The Reich protector had been summoned to Berlin. He would fly out on May 27th. That morning he would take his usual route from Panenské Břežany to Prague Castle. There was only one place on that route where the car would have to slow to nearly a stop. A hairpin turn on V. Holešovičkách Street, where the road bent sharply as it descended into the Libeň district. They would have perhaps 10 seconds. On May 26th, Gabčík and Kubiš retrieved their weapons from a hiding place. A Sten gun for Gabčík, 2 modified anti-tank grenades for Kubiš. They slept a little that night. At dawn, they rode their bicycles toward the hairpin turn. By 9 a.m., they were in position. Kubiš stood on the corner pretending to wait for a tram. Gabčík leaned against a fence post on the opposite side, his Sten gun hidden beneath a raincoat. Jozef Gabčík, a third operative, watched from 100 meters up the hill, a mirror in his hand to signal when the Mercedes approached. The wait was unbearable. A tram passed, then another. Pedestrians walked by, oblivious. A Nazi staff car came down the hill, but it was not the right one. The minutes stretched. Gabčík checked his weapon for the 10th time. The Sten was notoriously unreliable, prone to jamming at the worst moments, but it was what they had. At 10:29 a.m., sunlight flashed from the hill above. Gabčík's signal. The Mercedes was coming. Gabčík stepped into the road. Kubiš moved toward the curve. Both men understood what would happen next, not just in the following seconds, but in the days and weeks after. The reprisals, the executions, the villages that would burn. They knew. They had chosen. The dark green Mercedes entered the hairpin turn and began to slow. At 10:29 a.m. in Prague, the Mercedes rounded the bend. At the same moment in London, František Moravec sat at his desk staring at his hands. He had heard nothing from Prague in days. Radio silence as ordered. He did not know if Gabčík and Kubiš were still alive. He did not know if the operation would proceed. He could only wait. At 10:29 a.m. at Paninskie Břežany, Lena Heydrich was dressing the children. Klaus wanted to know when Papa would return from Berlin. Soon, she told him. Papa had important work. He was very important. At the hairpin turn, Heydrich sat in the front seat reviewing papers. His driver, Klein, saw the two men step toward the road. He assumed they were waiting for the tram. The Mercedes slowed to nearly 15 kilometers per hour to navigate the curve. Gabčík threw off his raincoat. He raised the Sten gun. He squeezed the trigger. Nothing happened. The gun had jammed. In the most critical second of his life, the weapon that Gabčík had checked obsessively for 5 months simply refused to fire. He stood in the middle of the road, the useless Sten in his hands, the Mercedes directly in front of him. Heydrich made a fatal error. Instead of ordering Klein to accelerate through, he stood up in the car, drew his pistol, and shouted at his driver to stop. He wanted to confront his attackers. He wanted to kill them himself. The car stopped, and Jan Kubiš threw his bomb. The modified anti-tank grenade struck the rear wheel well and detonated. The explosion tore through the car's body. Shrapnel ripped into Heydrich's back and side, driving fragments of horsehair upholstery and leather into his spleen. Kubiš himself was hit in the face by flying debris. For a moment everyone froze. Then chaos. Heydrich staggered from the car, still holding his pistol, and fired at Gabčík, who had dropped the useless Sten and was running. Kubiš mounted his bicycle, blood streaming from his face, and pedaled away. Klein chased Gabčík on foot. Heydrich took several steps, then collapsed against the fence. A Czech woman emerged from a nearby shop. She had no idea who the wounded SS officer was. She commandeered a delivery van and drove Heydrich to Bulovka Hospital. It was 10:42 a.m., 13 minutes after the attack. In London, Moravec still waited. He would not learn what had happened at the hairpin turn for another 6 hours. Heydrich was still alive when he reached Bulovka Hospital at 10:45 a.m. The emergency surgery lasted 3 hours. Surgeons removed his spleen and repaired the damage to his diaphragm. They flushed the wound repeatedly, but the fragments of horsehair and leather had carried bacteria deep into his body. In 1942, there was no penicillin available in Prague. Hitler sent his personal physician, Karl Gebhardt. Himmler flew to Prague. The German High Command was in shock. Heydrich, the blonde beast, the man with the iron heart, had been struck down on a public street by Czech partisans. The myth of Nazi invincibility had cracked. For 8 days, Heydrich seemed to recover. He was conscious, lucid, even making plans to return to work. Then on June 2nd, his condition suddenly deteriorated. The infection had spread. Septicemia set in. At 9 a.m. on June 4th, 1942, Reinhard Heydrich died. He was 38 years old. The Reich staged a massive state funeral in Berlin. Hitler himself laid a wreath. He was one of the greatest defenders of our greater German Reich, the Führer declared. A man with an iron heart. The reprisals began immediately, exactly as the home resistance had predicted, exactly as Gabčík and Kubiš had known they would. On June 9th, Nazi forces surrounded the village of Lidice, 10 kilometers from Prague. They had received false intelligence linking the village to the assassins. Every male over 15 was shot. The women were sent to Ravensbrück concentration camp. The children were dispersed, most to be gassed at Chelmno. The village itself was demolished, burned and bulldozed until nothing remained. The name was erased from German maps. 340 people from Lidice died. 2 weeks later, the village of Ležáky met the same fate. Across the protectorate, 1,331 Czechs were executed in the immediate aftermath, including 201 relatives of the assassins. More than 3,000 Jews were taken from the Terezín ghetto and sent to their deaths. Banish in London received the news in silence. The cost had been exactly as predicted. The choice could not be undone. Gabčík, Kubiš, and 5 other paratroopers hid in the crypt of the Church of Saints Cyril and Methodius in central Prague. The Orthodox Church's Bishop Gorazd had offered them sanctuary. For 3 weeks they lived in darkness beneath the nave, brought food by priests who knew they were risking death. On June 16th, one of their own betrayed them. Karel Čurda, a paratrooper from another operation, walked into Gestapo headquarters and gave up the location. He was paid 500,000 Reichsmarks. At 4:15 a.m. on June 18th, 750 SS troops surrounded the church. The siege lasted 7 hours. The paratroopers fought from the choir loft, then retreated to the crypt. The Nazis tried to flood them out by directing fire hoses through windows. When the SS finally broke through, they found all 7 men dead. Gabčík had shot himself with his last bullet. The hairpin turn had claimed its final price. Bishop Gorazd, who had sheltered the assassins, was arrested, tortured and shot on September 4th, 1942. The priests Jan Sonnevend and Vladimir Petrek were executed alongside him. The Orthodox Church in Bohemia and Moravia was dissolved by Nazi decree. Karel Čurda, the betrayer, survived the war. In 1947, a Czechoslovak court sentenced him to death for high treason. He was hanged on April 29, 1947, at Pankrak prison in Prague. Lena Heydrich lived until 1985, never disavowing her husband's crimes. She received a German government pension as a war widow. František Moravec, who had ordered the operation, emigrated to the United States after the communist takeover in 1948. He died in Washington in 1966, still defending the decision that cost so many Czech lives. "We had no choice," he wrote in his memoirs. "A nation that does not resist ceases to be a nation." History remembers Operation Anthropoid as the only successful assassination of a top Nazi official during the war, and it was. 7 men killed the architect of the Holocaust. But Anthropoid was also a story of impossible choices. Gabčík and Kubiš had the courage. They had the skill. What they carried with them to that hairpin turn was the full knowledge of what would follow. They chose anyway. Whether that choice was right, history has never fully decided.